Britain won World War II. Then Britain spent 60 years paying America for the privilege of having survived, not as punishment for losing, as the price of victory. We're taught that America saved Britain through generosity. Lend-Lease, the special relationship allies standing together. The financial records tell a different story. They tell of an empire stripped bare, not by enemies, but by friends. This isn't about blame. This is about understanding how wealth transfers between nations actually work and why the mechanism used on Britain became the template for global finance. The numbers are about to reshape everything you thought you knew. December 29, 2006. London. A clerk in the British Treasury processes a routine payment. The check is written to the United States Treasury. The amount $832 million. It is the final installment on a debt that began 60 years earlier in 1946, when Britain borrowed money to prevent its people from starving after winning World War II. The clerk closes the file. The debt is paid. 60 years of annual payments finally finished. But this clerk doesn't know the full story. Here's a number that should fundamentally change how you understand the 20th century. Britain borrowed $3.75 billion in 1946. Britain paid back $7.5 billion, double the principal. But the loan was just the visible debt. When you add up everything Britain transferred to America between 1940 and 2006, the gold liquidated the investment sold at fire sale prices. The strategic bases surrendered, the trading system dismantled. The total approaches $450 billion in today's money. For comparison, the Marshall Plan, celebrated as the greatest act of American generosity in history, cost $200 billion in today's money. America extracted more wealth from Britain alone than it gave to all of Europe combined. And Britain was the ally. Britain was on the winning side. What most people get wrong about World War II is this: they think the story ended in 1945. Victory parades, Hitler defeated, democracy saved. The financial story tells something different. The financial story shows that the real transfer of global power happened not on battlefields, but in boardrooms through contracts signed under duress, while bombs still fell on London. Margaret Thornton still remembered the exact moment she understood what victory really cost. She was 23 years old in 1946, working as a junior accountant at Barclays Bank in London. Her job that summer was processing the paperwork as British citizens surrendered their American investments to the government: stocks, bonds, securities, anything held in American companies. The government was selling them on the New York Stock Exchange to raise dollars. One afternoon, an elderly widow came in clutching share certificates her husband had left her. Pennsylvania Railroad, Standard Oil, blue-chip American stocks worth perhaps 40,000 pounds. The woman asked Margaret what price she would receive. Margaret had to explain the government would pay whatever New York buyers offered. The woman started crying quietly. She'd planned to live on those dividends. Now they were gone, sold to pay for a war Britain had already won. If you could see a chart showing the movement of gold from London to New York between 1939 and 1941, you would see the largest transfer of physical wealth in human history. Operation Fish. The secret convoys that shipped Britain's gold reserves across the Atlantic moved over $2 billion in gold bars to American vaults. Battleships loaded with bullion crossing U-boat-infested waters, delivering Britain's savings to pay for American supplies. The gold that had backed the pound sterling for centuries, packed into crates and shipped away forever. Here's a question worth sitting with. How does the winner of a war end up paying the loser's reconstruction costs while going bankrupt itself? Germany lost the war. Germany was destroyed, occupied, divided. Then Germany was rebuilt with Marshall Plan grants money that never had to be repaid. Britain won the war. Britain saved Western civilization by standing alone against Hitler. Then Britain paid America for 60 years. The mechanism that created this outcome wasn't accidental, it was designed. Charles Whitmore was 47 in 1941, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan's London office. He still remembered the exact moment he realized what was happening. He was reviewing the terms of an asset sale, British-owned securities being liquidated to raise dollars for war supplies. The prices were insultingly low, 20–30% below market value. "These are fire sale prices," he told his American colleagues on a transatlantic call. "They're being forced to sell." There was a pause. Then a voice from New York. "That's the point." Whitmore understood then that this wasn't ally helping ally, this was acquisition, this was foreclosure dressed up as friendship. Now contrast that with someone on the other side of the transaction. Thomas Brennan was 35 in 1941, a mid-level banker at Chase Manhattan in New York. He still remembered the exact moment he made his career. His job was finding American buyers for British assets being liquidated: factories, railroads, mining operations across Latin America and the United States. The British were desperate sellers. Brennan's clients were patient buyers. He matched them up and collected commissions on every transaction. By 1945, he'd earned more money than his father had made in a lifetime. "I felt guilty sometimes," he told his son decades later. "They were supposed to be our friends. But business is business." Brennan retired wealthy. The British investors whose assets he'd sold retired poor. The same war created both outcomes. Same economy, same historical moment, different sides of the transaction. In 1939, Britain was the world's dominant financial power. The British Empire covered a quarter of the earth. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. British overseas investments totaled $20 billion, generating $500 million annually, enough to balance the nation's trade deficit indefinitely. By 1945, the investments were sold. The gold was gone. The pound was broken. And Britain owed America billions. The military history says Britain won. The financial history says America acquired. There's a reason this story isn't taught in schools. There's a reason the financial terms of the special relationship remain buried in archives. And there's a reason the mechanism used to strip Britain became the template for the International Monetary Fund, which has since used the exact same playbook on over 80 countries. That mechanism had a beginning, a moment when desperate men signed documents that would cost their nation everything. December 1940. Winston Churchill picked up his pen and wrote the most important letter of his life. We ended part 1 with Winston Churchill picking up his pen to write the most important letter of his life. December 1940. Britain was broke. Germany was bombing London nightly, and the only nation capable of supplying what Britain needed to survive was demanding cash that Britain no longer had. Now let's understand exactly how the mechanism worked, because once you see it, you'll recognize it operating everywhere. To understand what happened to Britain, you first need to understand Britain's fatal vulnerability. Unlike America, Britain was an island that imported 60% of its food and almost all raw materials. Steel, oil, rubber, aluminum, everything had to be brought in by ship. Britain's industrial power, its ability to fight its citizens' ability to eat, all depended on keeping those supply lines open. Think of it like a family that earns good money, but has to buy everything: food, fuel, clothing from a single supplier across town. As long as the family has savings, they're fine. But what happens when the savings run out and the supplier demands cash on delivery? That was Britain in 1940. The savings were running out, and America was the only supplier. Germany understood this perfectly. The U-boat strategy wasn't just military, it was economic strangulation. Sink enough merchant ships and Britain starves. It was working. By December 1940, Britain had spent or committed nearly everything it had to keep supplies flowing. Here's where the mechanism gets interesting. America in 1939 was officially neutral. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts, which included a provision called cash and carry. Britain could buy American supplies, but only under two conditions: immediate cash payment and transport on British ships. No credit, no loans, no exceptions. This created a mathematical trap. Britain needed billions in supplies. Britain could only pay in gold dollars or by selling assets. All three were finite, and America knew exactly how finite they were. Edward Playfair was 31 in 1940, a rising star in the British Treasury. He still remembered the exact moment he understood the trap. He was running the numbers on Britain's reserves versus projected American purchases. "I sat there staring at the calculations," he later wrote, "and I realized we would be bankrupt by March 1941. Not might be, would be. The arithmetic was inescapable." Playfair took his calculations to his superiors. They already knew. Everyone knew. The question was what to do about it. From September 1939 to December 1940, Britain hemorrhaged wealth at a rate never seen in financial history. If you could see a visualization of gold flowing from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve in New York, you'd see a river of wealth crossing the Atlantic, $2 billion in physical gold bars loaded onto battleships, shipped through U-boat-infested waters, delivered to American vaults. Operation Fish, they called it. The largest movement of physical wealth in human history sent to pay for the privilege of survival. But gold wasn't enough. Britain ordered citizens to surrender their American investments. Stocks, bonds, anything held in American companies, all of it confiscated by the government and sold on the New York Stock Exchange. This raised another $1 billion. Still not enough. Then came the fire sales. What most people get wrong about Lend-Lease is this: they think it was American generosity rescuing a desperate ally. The historical record shows something different. Before Lend-Lease began, America demanded that Britain prove it had stripped itself of every asset it possessed. Henry Morgenthau Jr. was Secretary of the Treasury, the man running the American side of the negotiation. His position was clear: no American taxpayer money goes to Britain until Britain has sold everything it owns. He demanded a complete audit of the British Empire. Every asset owned by the government. Every asset owned by private citizens. Every gold bar, every share of stock, every factory. The British negotiators were stunned. They were being treated not as allies fighting a common enemy, but as a bankrupt company in receivership being audited by creditors before any further credit would be extended. Here's a question worth sitting with when your house is on fire and your neighbor has the only water. How much leverage do you have to negotiate fair terms for the water? Remember the widow that Margaret Thornton met at Barclays Bank, the one clutching her Pennsylvania Railroad shares, crying quietly when she learned the government would pay whatever New York buyers offered. That was the mechanism operating at individual scale. Now imagine it operating at national scale. Robert Brand was 62 in 1941, a senior British Treasury official sent to Washington to negotiate terms. He still remembered the exact moment he understood what America intended. He was in a meeting with Morgenthau's team explaining Britain's financial position when an American official interrupted. "We need to see everything. Complete transparency. Every asset in the empire." Brand started to object. This was sovereign information sensitive data. The American cut him off. "Those are the terms. Full disclosure or no discussion." Brand cabled London that night with one word: humiliation. But Britain had no choice. The audit proceeded. American accountants combed through British finances like creditors preparing a foreclosure. And then came the test case that revealed America's true intentions. American Viscose Company was Britain's most profitable American subsidiary, a textile manufacturer worth $125 million, generating $10 million annually in pure profit. It was a crown jewel, exactly the kind of asset an empire keeps forever. Morgenthau demanded Britain sell it. Not sell it at market value. Sell it at auction to the highest American bidder with no reserve price. The British ambassador, Lord Halifax, protested personally to Morgenthau. Forcing allies to liquidate prime assets while fighting a common enemy was unjust. Morgenthau's response was ice cold. This is what Americans expect. Arthur Salter was 59, the British official tasked with overseeing the American viscose sale. He still remembered the exact moment the bids came in. The winning offer, $54 million. 43% of market value. 43 cents on the dollar for Britain's best American asset, sold to pay for weapons to fight Hitler, while Americans watched safely from across the ocean. Salter wrote in his diary that night, "We are being stripped while we bleed." The fire sales continued throughout the war. British investments across Latin America, railroads and Argentina, copper mines in Chile, sold at desperate prices to American buyers. J.P. Morgan and Chase Manhattan organized the sales, collecting fees on every transaction. Remember Thomas Brennan from Part 1, the Chase banker who made his career matching desperate British sellers with patient American buyers. There were hundreds like him, all getting rich on the transfer. Here's the twist that most histories omit. The mechanism wasn't designed to help Britain win the war. It was designed to ensure that however the war ended, America would emerge dominant. Britain would survive, yes, but Britain would emerge broke, dependent, and permanently diminished. The garden hose analogy Roosevelt used to sell Lend-Lease, lending your neighbor a hose when his house is on fire, was brilliant politics. But it obscured the reality. This wasn't neighbor helping neighbor. This was acquisition. This was foreclosure dressed up as friendship. By December 1941, when America finally entered the war, Britain had already transferred the equivalent of $150 billion in today's money. And the war was only beginning. The real extraction, the terms that would bind Britain for 60 years, came later in 1946, when Britain thought victory entitled them to fair treatment. They were wrong. And the man who would fight hardest against America's terms would die trying. We ended Part 2 with the real extraction still to come, the 1946 terms that would bind Britain for 60 years. The man who would fight hardest against America's conditions would die trying. Now let's watch that fight unfold, because what happened in 1946 wasn't just negotiation. It was the moment an empire learned the price of survival. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The war that nearly destroyed Western civilization was over. Britain had stood alone against Hitler for 2 years before America entered. Britain had sacrificed everything: blood, treasure, the flower of a generation. Surely now, with victory achieved, Britain's closest ally would offer fair terms. The British government sent John Maynard Keynes to Washington. Keynes was 62 years old, the most famous economist in the world. He had invented macroeconomics. He had predicted the disasters that followed the Treaty of Versailles. Kings and presidents sought his counsel. If anyone could negotiate fair terms for Britain, it was Keynes. He arrived in Washington expecting justice. He expected America to recognize Britain's sacrifice. He expected gratitude, or at least fairness. He discovered that justice was not a currency Americans recognized. Richard Gardner was a young American diplomat assigned to observe the negotiations. He still remembered the exact moment he understood what was happening. Keynes had just finished a passionate speech about Britain's wartime sacrifice, about standing alone, about the moral debt America owed its closest ally. The American negotiators listened politely. Then their chief, Fred Vinson, responded, "Very moving, Professor Keynes. Now let's talk about the terms." Gardner watched Keynes's face fall. It was like watching a man realize his house had already been sold, Gardner wrote later. He just hadn't been told yet. What most people get wrong about the 1946 Anglo-American Loan is this: they think it was America helping Britain rebuild. The terms tell a different story. The terms tell of an empire being systematically stripped of its economic independence. The loan amount, $3.75 billion. Barely enough to prevent immediate starvation. Interest rate 2%, commercial terms, not ally-to-ally terms. Repayment period, 50 years of annual payments. But those weren't the killing conditions. The killing condition was sterling convertibility. Let me explain why this mattered. During the war, Britain had created something called the sterling area. Britain paid its empire countries, India, Australia, Egypt, dozens of others, in pounds. But those pounds couldn't be converted to dollars. This forced empire countries to hold pounds and buy British goods. It was the financial glue holding the empire together. America demanded that within 1 year of the loan, Britain make the pound fully convertible into dollars. Pause and consider what that meant. The moment convertibility began, everyone holding pounds would rush to exchange them for dollars. Why? Because American goods were better. American factories hadn't been bombed. American industry was the only game in town. There would be a run on the pound that would drain Britain's reserves in weeks. Keynes knew this was a death trap. He fought against it with everything he had. Lionel Robbins was a British economist on Keynes's negotiating team. He still remembered the exact moment Keynes understood he had lost. They were in a late-night session. Keynes had been arguing for hours against convertibility, presenting data projections, mathematical certainties about what would happen. The Americans listened, then they said no. Robbins watched Keynes slump in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. "We've lost the empire," Keynes said quietly. "Not to enemies, to friends." Here's a question worth sitting with. Why would America, having just fought alongside Britain to defeat fascism, impose terms designed to destroy British economic independence? The answer lies in Bretton Woods. In July 1944, while Britain still fought Germany, American and British negotiators met in New Hampshire to design the post-war financial system. The Americans came with a plan: the dollar would be the world's reserve currency. The IMF and World Bank would be headquartered in Washington, controlled by American votes. The system would entrench American financial dominance for generations. Keynes proposed an alternative, an international currency called Bancor that wouldn't favor any nation. The Americans rejected it. Keynes didn't have leverage. Britain was bankrupt. The American plan was adopted. The 1946 loan wasn't just about helping Britain survive. It was about forcing Britain into the Bretton Woods system as a subordinate, not a partner. Sterling convertibility would break the sterling area. British economic independence would end. American financial dominance would be complete. And here's the rage-inducing part. While Keynes fought desperately to save his country, American negotiators were simultaneously planning the Marshall Plan, which would give Germany and other European countries grants that never had to be repaid. Let that sink in. Germany lost the war. Germany was responsible for 50 million deaths. Germany would be rebuilt with free American money. Britain won the war. Britain saved Western civilization. Britain would pay for 60 years. Same America. Same moment in history. Different terms for the defeated enemy than for the victorious ally. Frederick Leith Ross was 63, a senior Treasury official who had served Britain for 4 decades. He still remembered the exact moment he learned the Marshall Plan would be grants, while the British loan was commercial debt. He was reading the American announcement in his London office. His hands began to shake. "They're rewarding the Germans," he said to his secretary, "and punishing us." He sat down heavily. For winning. The British Parliament debated the loan in December 1945. The terms were published. The humiliation was public. MPs called it Financial Munich, Britain appeasing America to survive just as Chamberlain had appeased Hitler. But what choice did they have? Refuse the loan and Britain starves. Accept the loan and Britain surrenders economic independence. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum dressed up as friendship. Parliament accepted. The vote was bitter, angry, ashamed. Britain signed away its future. John Maynard Keynes died on April 21, 1946. He was 62 years old. His heart gave out officially from overwork, but everyone who knew him understood the truth. The stress of trying to save Britain from its closest ally had killed him. He had seen what was coming and been unable to stop it. Remember Margaret Thornton from Part 1, the young accountant at Barclays who processed the paperwork as British citizens surrendered their American investments. By 1946, she was 23, still at the bank, watching the next phase unfold. The loan terms required Britain to release frozen sterling area balances. Overnight, the pound would become convertible. Margaret was assigned to help prepare for the transition. "We knew it would be chaos," she said later. "Everyone knew. But orders were orders." July 15, 1947. Convertibility began. If you could see a chart of Britain's dollar reserves over the next 5 weeks, you would see a line plunging towards zero. The moment the window opened, there was a run on the pound. India, Egypt, Australia, Argentina, everyone holding sterling rushed to convert to dollars. Exactly as Keynes had predicted. In just 35 days, Britain lost $700 million of the $3.75 billion loan. 20% of the entire loan evaporated in 5 weeks. On August 20th, 1947, Britain suspended convertibility. The experiment had failed catastrophically. Harold Wilson was 31, a young economist at the Board of Trade. He still remembered the exact moment the suspension was announced. He was in a meeting when a messenger arrived with the news. The room went silent. Someone said, "That's it then. We're finished as a great power." Wilson looked around at the faces of men who had fought in 2 world wars, who had believed in British greatness their entire lives. The strange thing, Wilson wrote in his diary, was that no one disagreed. The humiliation triggered immediate geopolitical consequences. In February 1947, before the convertibility crisis even completed, Britain sent a telegram to Washington. For a century, Britain had guaranteed Greek and Turkish independence against Russia. But Britain was broke. The telegram said, "We're leaving. If you want to stop the Soviets, you do it." This triggered the Truman Doctrine. America replaced Britain. It was formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound by 30% from $4.03 to $2.80. Overnight, British citizens became 30% poorer relative to the world. The empire that had ruled a quarter of the earth was being dismantled piece by piece. But the loan remained. Every year the British Treasury wrote checks to the American Treasury. Through prosperity and crisis. Through Suez and the winter of discontent. Through Thatcher and Blair, and everything that followed. 60 years of payments for having survived a war Britain won. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006. But by then, the real damage had been done long ago, not just to Britain, but to dozens of other countries who would face the same mechanism. Because the template created in 1946 didn't stay in 1946, it became the IMF playbook. And it's still operating today. We ended Part 3 with the template created in 1946 becoming the IMF playbook still operating today. The final British loan payment was made in 2006, but by then, the real damage had been done long ago. Now let's trace that damage forward, not just for Britain, but for the dozens of countries who would face the same mechanism. Because empires don't collapse in a single moment. They die slowly, payment by payment, until one day you look up and realize the wealth has been transferred somewhere else. Let me show you the full accounting. Not the simplified version. The complete wealth transfer from Britain to America between 1940 and 2006. Gold reserves liquidated $4 billion. Overseas investments sold at fire sale prices, $12 billion. American viscose and other forced sales, $2 billion. Lost income from those sold investments over 60 years, $30 billion, because those assets would have generated returns forever, and now they generated returns for American owners instead. Imperial preference trade system dismantled $200 billion in lost trade advantages. Strategic bases leased for 99 years, incalculable military value. Loan principal plus interest repaid $7.5 billion. Total, approximately $30 billion in 1940s dollars. In today's money, $450 billion. If you could see 2 columns side by side, British wealth in 1939 versus British wealth in 1950, you would see one of the largest peacetime transfers of national assets in history. Not through conquest, through contracts. What most people get wrong about this transfer is this: they think it was a one-time event. It wasn't. The mechanism kept extracting wealth for 60 years. Every annual loan payment, every year of lost investment income, every decade of diminished trade position. The extraction was slow, steady, and relentless. Here's a question worth sitting with: who specifically benefited from Britain's loss? The answer isn't America in some abstract sense. It's specific institutions, specific families, specific interests. Remember Thomas Brennan from Part 1, the Chase Manhattan banker who made his career matching desperate British sellers with patient American buyers. Let me tell you his full trajectory. By 1950, Brennan was a senior vice president at Chase. By 1960, he was managing director of international operations. By 1970, he sat on the boards of 3 corporations that had been British-owned before the war. He retired in 1978 with a net worth exceeding $15 million, built entirely on commissions and opportunities from the British asset transfer. His grandchildren attended Harvard and Yale. His family foundation still donates to museums in New York. The wealth extracted from Britain became American dynastic wealth passed down through generations. Now contrast that with the British side. Edmund Whitfield was a London stockbroker in 1940, 43 years old, managing portfolios for wealthy British families. His clients held American securities, the exact assets the government requisitioned. He processed the paperwork as those portfolios were liquidated, sold in New York at whatever prices buyers offered. His clients received pounds at government-set rates. The American securities they'd accumulated over generations gone. By 1950, Whitfield was still a stockbroker, but his business had shrunk by half. His clients no longer had American assets to manage. By 1960, he was semi-retired, living modestly in Kent. He died in 1972. Leaving his children a small house and almost nothing else. His grandchildren did not attend elite universities. There was no family foundation. The wealth that might have compounded for generations had been transferred across the Atlantic. Same industry, same era, different sides of the transaction, different generational outcomes. The pattern replicated across the British economy. The investments that would have funded retirement's educated children, built family legacies, all of it redirected to American ownership. Britain didn't collapse overnight. Britain slowly became poorer year by year relative to what it would have been. And then America used the same mechanism on everyone else. The Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and World Bank, were designed in 1944 and dominated by American votes. The playbook was established with Britain. It would be refined on country after country for the next 8 decades. The pattern is identical. Country faces crisis. IMF offers loan with conditions. Conditions require privatization of state assets, currency, convertibility, removal of trade protections. American corporations buy privatized assets at low prices. Country's industries can't compete with American imports. Country becomes permanently indebted, making payments for decades. Mexico, 1982. Argentina, 1989 and 2001. Brazil, multiple times. Indonesia, 1997. Thailand, 1997. Greece, 2010. Over 80 countries, same playbook, same wealth transfer, same American beneficiaries. Here's the unexpected twist that most histories omit. Britain helped create this system. At Bretton Woods, British negotiators signed onto institutions that would later strip other nations using the exact methods that stripped Britain. The victim became complicit in victimizing others. That's how the mechanism perpetuates itself, by making each victim an accomplice in the next extraction. Let me show you how this played out in a specific case. Argentina in 2001 faced a crisis eerily similar to Britain in 1947. Currency peg collapsing, reserves hemorrhaging, IMF demanding structural adjustment. The conditions privatize state industries, open markets to imports, maintain dollar convertibility. Carlos Mendez was 47, a manager at YPF, Argentina's state oil company. He still remembered the exact moment he learned YPF would be privatized. He was in a staff meeting when the announcement came. The company that had employed him for 22 years that his father had helped build would be sold to foreign buyers. Within 3 years, Carlos was unemployed. The new owner's Spanish, then American, cut staff by 60%. By 2010, Carlos was working as a taxi driver in Buenos Aires. "We built something for Argentina," he told a researcher. "They sold it to pay a debt we didn't create." Meanwhile, the American investment funds that bought Argentine assets at crisis prices made fortunes. The pension funds that acquired YPF shares saw values multiply as oil prices rose. The pattern was identical to Thomas Brennan in 1941, patient American buyers acquiring desperate sellers' assets, then watching those assets appreciate. Same mechanism. Different decade. Different country. Same outcome. Here's a question that should disturb anyone paying attention if this mechanism has operated for 80 years across 80 countries. Why isn't it more widely understood? The answer is that the mechanism is designed to be invisible. Each extraction is presented as a rescue. Each set of conditions is presented as necessary reform. Each country is told its crisis is unique, its fault, its responsibility to repay. The pattern is never acknowledged. The beneficiaries are never named. Remember Margaret Thornton, the young accountant at Barclays who processed paperwork as British citizens surrendered their investments. Let me tell you where her story ended. Margaret stayed at Barclays until 1985. She rose to mid-level management, respectable, but not wealthy. She retired on a modest pension. In 2003, at 80 years old, she saw a television documentary about the 1946 Anglo-American Loan. She watched increasingly agitated as historians explained the terms. "I was there," she told her daughter afterward. "I saw it happening, but I never understood what it meant. They made it sound like America was helping us. It wasn't help. It was..." She struggled for the word. "It was harvest. We were being harvested." Margaret died in 2008, 2 years after Britain made its final loan payment. She lived long enough to see the debt extinguished, but not long enough to see whether her country would ever recover what it lost. The final payment in 2006 was processed quietly. No ceremony, no acknowledgement. Just a wire transfer from the British Treasury to the American Treasury. The clerk who processed it probably didn't know the history. Probably didn't know about Keynes dying of stress or American viscose sold for 43 cents on the dollar, or 60 years of payments for having won a war. Some debts show up on balance sheets. Others show up in diminished expectations and opportunities foreclosed in wealth that compounds in one country instead of another. Britain made its final payment. But the mechanism that stripped Britain didn't retire. It's still operating, still extracting, still transferring wealth from debtor nations to creditor institutions. And the same question that faced Britain in 1946 faces dozens of countries today. When you're desperate and your creditor holds all the leverage, what choice do you really have? The answer to that question echoes from 1946 to the present moment. We ended Part 4 with a question. When you're desperate and your creditor holds all the leverage, what choice do you really have? The mechanism that stripped Britain didn't retire after 2006. It's still operating. Now let's bring this story into the present, because the same pattern that transferred $450 billion from Britain to America is operating right now at a scale that dwarfs anything we've discussed. Global debt today stands at $317 trillion. That's not a typo. $317 trillion owed by governments, corporations, and households worldwide. Much of it denominated in dollars. Much of it owed to American institutions. Much of it carrying conditions that look remarkably similar to the terms imposed on Britain in 1946. The mechanism doesn't change. Only the scale changes. Let me show you the pattern one more time, now that you can recognize it. Country faces crisis currency, pressure, trade, deficit. Inability to pay for imports. Creditors offer loans with conditions. Conditions require opening markets, privatizing assets, maintaining currency convertibility. Foreign buyers acquire assets at distressed prices. Debt payments continue for decades. Wealth transfers from debtor to creditor. Britain, 1946. Mexico, 1982. Argentina, 2001. Greece, 2010. Sri Lanka, 2022. Same playbook, same beneficiaries, different victims. Here's a question worth sitting with if you were designing a system to transfer wealth from weak nations to strong ones without military conquest. How would it differ from the system currently operating? Remember James Crawford from Part 1, the American Treasury official who helped structure the 1946 loan and later said, "We knew exactly what we were doing. We were buying the British Empire at a discount." His successors are still working. They're at the IMF, at the World Bank, at the major investment banks. The institutions have grown more sophisticated. The language has become more technical. But the mechanism is unchanged. Maria Santos is 43, an economist at the central bank of a South American country I won't name to protect her position. She still remembered the exact moment she understood her country was caught in the same trap Britain faced. She was reviewing IMF loan conditions, the requirements attached to emergency funding during a currency crisis. The terms were almost identical to what I'd read about Britain in 1946, she told a researcher. Currency convertibility, privatization of state assets, opening markets to imports. I thought this is the same document just with different names filled in. Her country accepted the terms. They had no choice. The payments continue. What most people get wrong about international debt is this: they think loans are designed to be repaid. Many loans are designed to never be fully repaid, to create permanent payment streams from debtor to creditor, extracting wealth indefinitely. Britain paid for 60 years. Many countries today have been paying for longer with no end in sight. But here's the unexpected twist that complicates the story. The mechanism isn't purely American anymore. China has learned the playbook. Chinese development loans to African and Asian countries now carry conditions remarkably similar to IMF structural adjustment infrastructure concessions, resource extraction rights, strategic asset access. When Sri Lanka couldn't repay Chinese loans in 2017, China took a 99-year lease on Hambantota port. Sound familiar? It should. America took 99-year leases on British Caribbean bases in 1940, using the exact same logic. The student has become the teacher. The mechanism has gone global. Let me offer a framework for understanding what you're seeing, not predictions, not financial advice, just questions worth asking. First, when you see a country in crisis accepting emergency loans with conditions attached, ask who benefits from those conditions. Not in theory. Specifically, which institutions acquire the privatized assets? Which countries' exports gain access to newly opened markets? Second, when debt is discussed as a national problem requiring sacrifice from citizens, ask whether the creditors are making equivalent sacrifices, or whether the solution transfers wealth in one direction only. Third, when financial arrangements are described as rescue or aid or partnership, ask what the terms would look like if they were designed to extract maximum value from a desperate borrower. Then compare to the actual terms. These questions don't give answers, they give clarity. Remember the widow that Margaret Thornton met at Barclays in 1946, the elderly woman clutching Pennsylvania Railroad shares. Her husband had left her crying quietly when she learned the government would pay whatever New York buyers offered. Her story didn't end in that bank. Her shares were sold. Her dividends vanished. Her retirement plans collapsed. She lived another 20 years on a fraction of what she'd expected. But somewhere in New York, someone bought those shares. Someone collected those dividends. Someone's grandchildren inherited wealth that had been built in part on purchases made from desperate British sellers in their darkest hour. The wealth didn't disappear. It transferred. If you could see a map showing the flow of wealth over the past 80 years, From debtor nations to creditor institutions, from crisis countries to patient buyers, from desperate sellers to opportunistic acquirers, you would see a pattern so consistent it would be difficult to call it coincidence. You would see the same mechanism operating across decades, across continents, across dozens of countries. The signature truth of this entire story is simple: victory doesn't guarantee prosperity. Britain won World War II and paid for 60 years. Being right doesn't protect you. Being strong doesn't protect you. Only understanding the mechanism protects you, and even then, only if you're not already trapped. This video wasn't about condemning any nation or institution. It was about seeing clearly. The financial history of the 20th century isn't the story told in textbooks of generous allies rebuilding a shattered world. It's a story of leverage, of contracts signed under duress, of wealth transferred through mechanisms designed to appear as assistance. Britain emerged from World War II as a moral giant, but an economic pygmy. They did the right thing, stood alone against Hitler, sacrificed everything to save Western civilization. And they paid for it until 2006. There's a lesson in that, maybe several lessons. What those lessons mean for our current moment with $317 trillion in global debt, with currency systems under pressure, with the same institutions still operating the same playbooks, is something each viewer will have to decide for themselves. I started this video with a clerk in the British Treasury processing a final payment in 2006. 60 years of checks to the United States Treasury. A debt finally extinguished. A file finally closed. But the mechanism that created that debt never closed. It just found new countries to process. The question isn't whether this history is disturbing. The question is what you do once you understand it's still operating.